Hi everyone, you're very welcome to our webinar, Data Centres, Sustainability, Energy Efficiency and Extractivism. Thank you so much for coming to our event this evening. Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Patrick Brody, FRQSC Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill University. He's also a Scholar in Residence in the School of Irish Studies at Concordia University. We're joined by Ms. Donna Gartland, who's the CEO of Codema, the Energy Efficiency Agency Dublin. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Mel Hogan, who's the Director of the Environmental Media Lab and Associate Professor of Communication, Media and Film at the University of Calgary. Tonight, we'll hear a variety of perspectives on data centre development. Data centres have been a key feature of Ireland's enterprise strategy. However, recently, they've become a growing point of concern both for our climate targets and our energy security. EirGrid, who operate Ireland's national energy grid, predict that data centres could account for 27% of Ireland's electricity demand by 2028. Tonight, we want to discuss how we can stay digitally connected while aligning with our energy targets and a just transition.
Electricity supply that goes into data centers is actually transformed to heat. So if you think about, having your laptop on your lap for too long, you can tell basically how much heat comes off. So if you can multiply that by obviously millions of these servers, millions of these computers inside a data center, the vast majority of the electricity that goes in comes out the other side as heat. In Ireland, I suppose all data centers will have backup on site as well. And I suppose in the future, this is something that the grid is looking to use now as grid balancing services to help integrate more renewables. So, I mean, if you're going to have these big data centers there and they're going to have a lot of backup on site, backup generation on site, why not use it, I suppose, instead of investing more money into backup services for the electricity grid, using what they have on site as that balancing power. And I suppose the conversations we've had with the data center industry in Ireland is, if they're not going to go here, they are going to go somewhere else. And at the moment, that is other countries that have lower renewable electricity supply, such as Turkey. So Turkey would be their big rival kind of country in terms of where they're located in Europe. And, there's a lot of new data centers as well locating in the Nordic countries, again, because of their renewable supply, but also because of their availability of district heating, which I'll speak a little bit about in a few minutes. So why in Dublin and why are they concentrated here? So in Dublin, we have, I suppose most of the data centers are located in and around the Dublin region. So this is information from a website called bitpower.ie. They do very good statistics on data centers and update all the planning and what's coming down the line and stuff like that. It's a very good resource. So all the data centers where they're located in these industrial areas follows what's called the T50. So it's kind of the data fiber highway for Dublin. So a bit like our M50 motorway, this blue line around Dublin is the fiber network highway, and it's really the key attraction, as well as our low tax rates, of course, for data centers in Ireland. It's not a kind of a common misconception is that it's our climate, but it's not actually that. This is the most attractive. They're the most attractive reasons. So obviously Dublin, then we want to try to decarbonize Dublin. I said that's our mission, is to decarbonize Dublin. Obviously, a lot of data centers doesn't really help that mission a hell of a lot. So it's how can we, looking at the whole energy system, how can we, I suppose, look at data centers, take them into account, and I suppose make the best of them being there. So we've developed what's called the Dublin Region Energy Master Plan. It's the first of its kind in Ireland. We developed cost optimal pathways to meet the 2030 and 2050 targets. It's an integrated energy model. It takes in, it's spatially led, which is, I suppose, quite unusual for typical energy models. So we're looking at constraints, where things are located, grid locations, and taking all those things into consideration. Also, a key component is the social and economic impacts of any kind of transition roadmap as well for Dublin. So I suppose this is quite a new way of modelling energy. Usually it's just on a cost benefit, a cost basis, whatever's the lowest cost. So we've developed this kind of digital twin evidence base of the Dublin energy system, which allows us to analyse the best possible pathways. And just to give you an overview then, this is the current situation in Dublin, the total emissions. So you can see that even despite, I suppose, the amount of data centres we have in Dublin, heat is still the biggest energy user in the Dublin region. Electricity 26%, transport 28%. And if you look at the other, sorry, I should say that these are emissions, sorry, not energy. So heat is the biggest energy or biggest CO2 emitter, whereas electricity is only 26%. And if you see where the emissions come from in Dublin, on the right-hand side there, you can see data centres contribute 16%, and that's obviously the electricity that they use. So that's an ever-growing part of that part of the pie chart wasn't there a few years ago, and I suppose now it's becoming an ever-increasing part of that pie chart. And it's kind of like, what do we do about that? And one of the solutions that we're working on for the heat part can also overlap and integrate and help solutions in the data center part, and that's systems called district heating. So because this is a very new, still quite a new topic in Ireland, I always have to put this slide in somewhere, because I guess so used to talking about it, I forget that, you know, a lot of people probably haven't heard of the concept before. And it's basically an underground pipeline system for hot water. So if you think about an electricity grid, which transports electrons through cables, district heating system transports hot water through underground insulated pipes. Very easy, simple system. They're all over the world. We just don't happen to have them in Ireland yet. Common across Europe, cities like Copenhagen, Stockholm, Helsinki, all have 90% of their buildings connected to these networks. So if we look at them where we should be developing these schemes in Dublin, we want to look at, I suppose, the lowest carbon and the cheapest sources of heat that will replace, I suppose, importing fossil fuels, which is, I suppose, a big topic now, you know, where our heating systems are very reliant on gas, particularly in Dublin. So how can we move off those? And if you can see, this map is basically a heat source, all the heat sources available in Dublin. And the red dots, I wonder if I can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor on the screen? Yes, great. So these big red blobs are the data center waste heat. So you can see that they're grouped together in these kind of industrial areas that follow that T50 network around the edge of the city. And obviously they produce a lot of heat, but also, you know, there's lots of other sources of waste heat in Dublin as well. Power stations being the biggest one. You know, I suppose when we think about inefficient systems, we don't often think about our electricity, but half of the gas or the fuel that goes into power stations that produce electricity, about half of that is lost, and that's in the form of heat. So those chimneys that you see that off power plants, where you'd see it might look like smoke that comes out, that's actually steam. So instead of, I suppose, throwing that away, what we need to do is divert that into district heating networks. So we're looking at these sources, and data centers obviously is a big part of the picture as well. So in our pathways that we've developed to 2030 and 2050 in terms of heating, we've looked at spatially the areas that are suitable for either district heating or heat pumps. I suppose they're the two kind of solutions that are being put forward by government, and the two, I suppose, lowest carbon solutions for us in Ireland. And you can see the red, the areas there that are red, pink or light pink are suitable for district heating. Obviously the dark red areas are the most suitable areas. Sorry, this map is very small, maybe on the screen, but so these are the areas that are where district heating is a better solution in terms of euros per ton of CO2 saved. We've also outlined, I suppose, the areas where we can meet the climate action plan targets. So if we rolled out district heating in those areas, we would meet the 2030 climate action plan target for Ireland. And then we've also looked at it out to 2050 as well, to see how I suppose, waste heat sources change and move, and see where exactly district heating is and district heating even in 2050 is still a cheaper solution to save CO2 than heat pumps. And it also, I suppose, there's also socioeconomic benefits in terms of indigenous sources, circular economy, etc., that we've also taken into account. So this is our plan, I suppose, is those areas for district heating and heat pumps for everywhere else. So then we overlap that with the last map that you saw on the heat sources, and then that allows us, I suppose, to start planning those networks. And one of those networks that we're planning is in Tala. It's called the Tala district heating system. It's the first large-scale district heating system in Ireland. It's, as I said, I'm a director on the company that's been set up there. So it's the first not-for-profit energy utility in Ireland that's going to run this system. We're taking the waste heat off the data center, which I'm allowed to say is an Amazon data center now, because they had that tied up for a long time. I wasn't allowed to say the word Amazon, but so the Amazon data center there, we're taking the waste heat. We've built they give us land as well for an energy center on the side of the data center. So we're building the energy center. It's going to supply heat to the local buildings that you can see in the map there. Main customers are the first customers are the public sector buildings, the college campuses and that, and then all new apartments, any new buildings in the area. And we're going to, I suppose, gradually build on that network and supply out to existing housing areas as well. Another scheme that we've just is in early stage development is in Blanchestone, and that's another data center. So the first two big scale schemes, district heating schemes in Ireland, are going to be based off data centers. And this is a scheme that's in development in an area in Fingal called Blanchestone. We're looking at key anchor load customers that are public sector. Equinix, the data center provider there, is very, very interested and on board. This is the first market that they could actually do something like this, and they've been looking to do something like this for a long time in other countries. So you can see there the key stakeholders that are involved in this, in developing this particular project, which we hope to get to market in the near future. And I suppose challenges and barriers then to actually using waste heat from data centers is the location of the data centers. Obviously, they need to be close to the demands. There's no point in them being out in the middle of nowhere, because then we can't transport the heat to the buildings. The data centers, when they go in, need to be future-proof to be able to connect. It's very hard to retrofit into data centers. They don't even let us look over the wall in Amazon in Tala. So they won't let us in to do any retrofit, nor it's very expensive to do it afterwards. So it is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, where when you don't have a grid available to connect to, why are you asking them to future-proof? So I suppose that's why we want to bring in planning requirements for zoning for district heating, so that we can future-proof supply and demand, and we start putting the pipes in the ground. And I suppose for more detailed information, we have published a recommendations paper on waste using heat from data centers that we developed in partnership with Euroheat and Power and other colleagues across Europe. That's available at that link on our website. I know I've talked very fast, but I was trying to fit everything in, knowing that I'm the first and I don't want other speakers to take up their time. So I suppose, yeah, that's it really. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions on that. Thanks, Jessie.
That was so interesting, Donna, and that was like so much information, but all so interesting. And it's interesting that at the end you were saying that it's quite difficult to retrofit data centers, because that was one of the questions we got, was how feasible is it to retroactively equip existing data centers for district heating? So you've kind of mentioned that, but could you maybe say more?
Yeah, so they don't like going back in and changing things, obviously, because they don't like any downtime on their servers, or any potential downtime, or messing about with anything once it's up and running. Now, it does depend on the data center. Some of them are, as I said, more proactive than others. Some are more tied up with legal. Usually the American big ones have a lot more legal strings and hoops that they have to jump through that won't allow us basically to retrofit. But I suppose, due to the proactive nature of some of the local authorities that we've been working with in Dublin, some of them are already future-proof and already able to, I suppose, connect easily. So like the Equinix Centre, when that was being built, they had a planning, I suppose, requirement in there that they would be district heating ready. So it's about kind of making sure that that's in the planning requirements, and that's something that we really want to kind of try and lobby for. And it's something that there's a new heat policy being developed by the government at the moment, and this is one of the key things we want to put in there, is to make sure that all waste heat, data centers, power plants, whatever it is, are all future-proof to connect to these networks.
Right, interesting. There's loads of questions coming in now, and I don't think we've got time for all of them, but I'll ask this one because I think you were saying that data centers, they have to be planned for the district heating to work. They have to be close to the demand for the district heating, and at the moment I think Ingrid is hoping to move data centers out of Dublin and into areas closer to where the energy generation is happening to power the data centers. So someone asked, where a data center developer is seeking permission in an area where there is no district heating, what would you recommend? Should the planning application include necessary infrastructure to the boundary of their site? Well, that's kind of two questions, but
yeah. I suppose, look, if there's no possibility for district heating, like, you know, those maps that I showed for Dublin, like, you know, in those areas, the blue areas where heat pumps are more feasible, and, you know, the likelihood of district heating networks being built out there, you know, there's no real point, I suppose, in asking them to put in that enabling infrastructure. There could be other things instead they could do that would help, like local communities or local, or, you know, I suppose to decarbonize the local area instead, like solar panels or something else that would benefit the local area. But yeah, like, I know EirGrid's strategy is to move them out closer to the demands, and I understand that, but I suppose you can still move them hopefully out to near demands, which are also close to heat demands. So you have that kind of overlapping thing. And again, it's about joined up thinking. You know, in Ireland, we have a very habit of working in silos. So the electricity sector does one thing, the heat sector does another thing, and then the transport sector does another thing. And I suppose in a decarbonized smart energy system, we all need to work together to make sure we kind of, I suppose, make the most of all of our resources.
Very fair. I'll ask one more question from Tom, which is kind of a hard one. Well, it's just kind of a simple little one. But do you think that more data centers should be developed in Ireland? Obviously, the district heating system that derived from the waste from data centers is great, but I'd be wary of data centers, especially amidst the current climate crisis. So I guess that question is kind of like, do the benefits outweigh the costs?
Yeah, look, I suppose our stance is that wherever they are already, you know, and wherever they're being planned, that we will take the, you know, we should be looking to take the waste heat. You know, I still do kind of stand by that, you know, we do need data centers, unless we all don't do these Zoom calls or anything else anymore, or don't, you know, take all loads of photos on our holidays and store them back up on the cloud. Like, you know, and I know maybe the following speakers will talk about actual need for data centers, and, you know, I suppose we're looking at exactly what we use them for. They will go somewhere, and, you know, Ireland has a very progressive targets, and in fact, you know, by 2050 we're supposed to be net exporters of energy. And there's a big, you know, we have a huge offshore wind potential, one of the biggest in Europe. So I suppose, look, if they are going to locate somewhere in Europe, would you rather that they're 100% fueled by our offshore wind and that we have those sales directly to those data centers, or will they, you know, would you prefer that we use data centers that are not 100% fueled by, you know, renewable electricity, and that are located somewhere else? And then we also obviously can't take advantage of any other system, you know, waste heat and stuff like that as well. It's not an easy, I know that's not a clear answer, but yeah, in my opinion, I suppose, you know, it should be a rank, like, we shouldn't, I suppose, completely blank them off. It is an opportunity to sell renewable electricity and to get them to invest. I mean, you know, one of the things that we're trying to do with the councils in Dublin is make sure that the data centres have power purchase agreements in Ireland, so that they're actually paying for the renewable electricity investments as well, so that they're, you know, that it's not being put on, I suppose, the public to fund.
I think that's a great bit of nuance added to the conversation. That's really valuable. And I think if you are sticking around, there's loads more questions in the Q&A chat there, and I think people would probably appreciate it if you can type an answer to them in the chat.
Yeah, no
so
worries.
People can have a little bit more feedback. We might move on to Mel now for the sake of time, if that's okay. Thank you so much, Donna, for sharing. That was really insightful.
Yeah, that was incredible. What a great talk. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here. All right, so I'm going to assume that everyone can see that. That's okay.
Yep, that's perfect.
Right, and I saw that there was already a bit of a conversation happening about art in the chat, so I was happy to see that, because I am going to look at that as well. I'm just going to put a timer here so that I don't go. It's hard to time that 10 minutes. It's like fast and furious. And so I guess, you know, part of my understanding what the seminar or this webinar is, like the purpose of it is today, is to try to figure out how and who gets to talk about data centers and making that infrastructure more accessible and more sort of environmentally conscious, and who gets to determine those kind of collective futures. And so what I'm going to do today, hopefully in these 10 minutes, is just try to bring a critical media studies perspective to this, which is a kind of subset, or can be thought of as a subset, as critical infrastructure studies in the academic world. Basically here, one thing that I noticed when this event was advertised on on Twitter, one of the first responses immediately was this kind of thing that I think we're quite used to, right? So this is not to pick on this person at all. I think this is a very sort of common misunderstanding and a common question we might have, like, who gets to speak to these futures? Who gets to talk about data centers? And it's in this, sort of it's the actually that stood out to me in this, because it was sort of implying that it goes without saying that without industry, you're not having a useful, practical, insightful conversation about data centers. And so I just thought, well, as critical media scholars, as artists, we do something quite different. And I would say it's a very important contribution to this. So again, it's not to pick on this person. I think it's really, it sort of informs this question, a question of the webinar, a question I sense, which is what does activism in and around the data center look like these days? What form does it take? And what's our end goal? And I think that question Tom asked earlier was really interesting in relation to, like, is it a kind of trade-off? Is the data center sort of this inevitable thing that constitutes our futures? So unlike for industry, I would say that critical discussions bring people from various backgrounds together. And in the context of this webinar, it's explicitly to push for this idea of the public good, to think collectively, I would say, towards progressive social change, as opposed to for profit, right? So this is a conversation industry might have with itself. So the academic perspective is different from industry, and I think it's really important to relocate these conversations of value, both in terms of the data center, but in terms of which conversations we're allowed to have away from profit. So some of you might be familiar with this book, but Nicole Starozilski and Lisa Parks wrote in the introduction of their book Signal Traffic, and the quote is here, but basically that media infrastructures are material forms as well as discursive constructions. And you can read the rest of the quote there, but in the interest of time, I'll just sort of skip over. But it's basically just to say that there is, when we say industry, it's a very sort of complex and I would say fractured sort of set of questions that we're asking. So just a quick note about what qualifies me to be here today. I've written a bunch of articles about data centers, so I won't go into those today, but I'll put sort of links to a whole bunch of things in the Q&A after. And there's also this shared open bibliography that I've started. These are just 2 pages. I think it's up to 15 pages now that anyone can sort of consult, add to, and edit. And I think this is important because we might think there is not that much sort of investment in data center if we're outside of the field of media studies, but there's loads and loads of scholarship dedicated to that. So I want to draw attention to that. And then also, I think it's skipped here. I think the slides are glitching a bit. I don't know if you, anyway, I won't touch it too much because I think it's skipped one. But I will also sort of put a link to, there it is, to the Data Center Industrial Complex podcast, a series of podcasts. And the 3rd episode in particular looks at questions of land, water, energy, these big, broader questions of extractivism and so on. And I wanted to make a quick note also about, it's not Ireland specific, but Alberta, where I live, which is on sort of the west coast of Canada, it's being pitched as this new hub for data centers in crypto mining, etc. But it is the opposite of what we just heard from Donna. It's like the most sort of alt-right, right-wing, like neoliberal, like endeavor to set this stuff up. So it'd be interesting to do a comparative case study in some sense of the different politics, right? A data center is not just a data center. They're like imbricated in tons of these political moves. Okay, so the project I really want to talk about, and I have 5 minutes left, so I won't do it justice, but basically another thing that I wanted to focus on is the work of artists working on through the data center. I have collected, and I put the link there and I'll put it in the Q&A, but basically, it's a pretty significant, I would say it's a pretty significant number of artists. This is sort of the entire list that you can see of people since the, early mid 2000s up until today who have been documenting the data center, intervening in the data center, doing work about the data center in really interesting ways. And I think that they're, I'm writing an article now about all the things in which these, all the things these works highlight. But for today, I'm just going to draw your attention to 4. You might be familiar with some of them. Ingrid Burnton has been a huge influence to a lot of people in my field, but also one of the first people, and this sounds rather obvious today in some sense, but of rendering the invisible visible. And there's tons of the artworks in the slide I just showed you that do this work, whether they, whether through sort of photographing data centers, recording audio inside of them, just this work of bringing the public's attention to the infrastructure of the cloud, demystifying the cloud. A little bit obvious today, but this has been a decade in the making, and I think it's really significant. And I think we owe both NGO scholars, et cetera, like we owe artists for doing some of this work. And then another piece that I like, this is one that I saw just before the pandemic hit in Barcelona. Mario Santamaria does a whole bunch of work on cloud infrastructure. One piece that I really liked was the one where he basically, tracks the data from his own website, and he goes to each ISP data center on foot. And so he follows basically the data, and it takes him 2 weeks to sort of redo the path that it takes. He says 67 milliseconds for his data to travel. And so there, again, there's this sense of, the compression of time and space that is being documented through these artworks. Anyway, I really encourage you to check him out. I think most of his work is in around cloud infrastructure, and it's really, really interesting stuff. Another one that you might be less familiar with, which is has had also a few iterations, and in some sense it's the one that moves the idea of data cloud storage away from this conception of the cloud in a really playful way. So this is a group, it involves 2 artists and a scientist, Cyrus Clark, Monica Siegfried, and Jeff Navala. And so they're sort of artists and scientists working from Europe and the US. But what they've done is basically, and there was Karen Pfister who had done this a couple of years earlier, more conceptually, more scientifically, but this group of artists, what they did was say, what if we stored our data onto the DNA of plants, right? And so they're trying to shift the, the idea of cloud storage onto this data garden. And they have done like exceptionally beautiful work today. So I really encourage you to look this up in more detail. They have a lot of video documentation that speaks to both the conceptual and political sort of ramifications. In part, they say, well, in the cloud, that's really abstracted, and so we don't care, and we don't tend to our data in the same way that we would in and through plants. And so they opened up this flower shop and had conversations with the public. So it's sort of a public-facing, kind of engagement with data storage. And I think that work is really important. And then finally, so just about a minute left here, the last project, you might be familiar with Timo Arnal. He has done some really interesting stuff. He's known as a visual artist, but I would say his work is as evocative in terms of what he does with the audio as the visual. And what he reflects on is really sort of, these questions of energy and the sort of palpable sort of, the sort of embodied experience of being in the data center, and reflects really on that, like these infrastructures that we create that are sort of spaces that are not really designed for humans at all. And so that I believe is an environmental question. And I would say 90% of the works on critical studies of the cloud, even though they're about the data center, they're about the environment. And so they're challenging ways in which these infrastructures are assumed to be building futures and inherent signs of progress and so on. And so he really documents in these beautiful cinematic ways, the ways in which the data center is a problematic space in terms of I guess cohabitation or embodiment of these kinds of things. So I think that's time, so I'll leave it there, but obviously this is like a little sliver of all the great artwork that's been doing, but I just wanted to draw your attention to it.
That was so interesting. Thanks, Mel. I wanted to ask, just before anyone else has a chance to ask a question, like thinking about the case study of, for example, like the Tala district heating, or like a district heating, proposed project, or a data center proposed project. Is there a way that you can see art projects similar to some of the ones that you described, sort of opening up the conversation to local people so that they can understand and have sort of more of a voice or participation in the decision making of projects like this?
Yeah, absolutely. Like one actually, the Mario Santamaria, he's an artist who also organizes tours for the public, and I think quite a few artists. If we were to go through the index in critical studies of the cloud, I think that for many artists, this is one of the incentives is to demystify, is to bring people's attention. And that I think, you know, I'm thinking of this webinar today. It's like, how do you do activism in and around the data center? Well, you have to have buy-in from people who are in and around these data centers. And, you know, in Alberta, where I am, the conversation is so different. It's about perceived optimism about the future. It's like almost like a big tech aura. Like if Google is here, if Amazon is here, that's somehow inherently good. Like it makes the province look good. It's so problematic, but like in a conservative space, there are different conversations happening. So I think to demystify not just the infrastructure, but the politics of the infrastructure, artists do that extremely well, I would say, and have done for a couple decades now. So they've been really like on it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think I've noticed as well in Ireland when data centers first were becoming like first being raised in the public awareness, I'll say it was through art projects. I think there was two different art projects. One was like a walking tour of data centers, and one was like using aerial drone footage of data centers to kind of, to start studying them. But there's a question from Andy in the chat saying, "Hi Mel, can you quickly make the case for using visual art to communicate with the public at all? Isn't it a fairly narrow slice of the population that consumes this type of thing?" Controversial question.
I think visual art doesn't just sort of stay, you know, within the gallery. I think it changes, you know, cultural ideas, perceptions of infrastructure. I mean, I think this is how we chip away at changing sort of cultural representations around anything. And I think art is one component of that. So I don't know if in your question you're thinking sort of art that is, you know, within a specific context, but I think together as we pool, and like the artworks on the site that I've collected are really international. There's just like artists everywhere really working on sort of demystifying these things. So I would say that I often will read now in the media, there's almost like a lag where the media, mainstream media will be picking up on stories now of data centers. I'm seeing them circulate more in the last 2 years. Artists have been on this for decades. And so I think that they, whether it's subconsciously, but they participate in changing cultural conversations around these things. I don't think it's as narrow. It's hard to measure, of course, but I would say in the same way that sort of pop culture has pretty important impacts on the ways in which we come to understand things and put into question something like the cloud. Like I ask a lot of my undergrad students if they know where their data is stored, and I would say each year that is somehow less mysterious to them. Each year there's more of a sense that there's a material component to this. Now, whether that's all, you know, I show a lot of art in my classes, but I think it's a mix of like art, pop culture. I think all of these things, you know, whether it's in the James Bond movie where the data center is like prominent sort of part of the villain, I don't know, infrastructure. You know, I think pop culture, art, all these things work together to change the cultural conversation. That's why I think like industry does its own thing, has its own particular kind of conversations, but I think these things come together to offer a different critique at the very least. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, like this filtering of like high fine art or like sort of more inaccessible art in galleries kind of filtering into like James Bond films, which is maybe something that is more reaches a broader audience. And I was thinking, you know, you're saying that artists have kind of been ahead of the curve in terms of like being aware of data centers and analyzing them. Do you think that means there's more of an insight from the art world into the potential future of data centers, or do you have any thoughts yourself on what you see happening?
Yeah, and I see a question in there that's sort of echoing that, this idea of demystification sort of like not being enough for the kind of work that needs to be done. And I think what's interesting is, you know, whether it's scholarship or, you know, humanities or social science scholarship or an art practice. And a lot of the artworks are actually MA or PhD students doing research creation. So there is overlap between those two things. And the part I skipped over a little bit is to say that, you know, the work that I do, and I think that artists do, is they basically take a pulse on sort of the imaginaries and the ways in which people are making sense of particular technologies. And so some people will be like what Donna just presented, that to me is like the people doing the work of solving the issues. Scholars and artists do something very different, where we're not trying to get the truth or problem solve. We're trying to say, you know, you look at like the Amazon piece that I put as an example that was a bit glitchy, is that there's all of these comments. There were like 150 comments from people in Alberta making sense of what bringing data center infrastructure or industry into the province might do for our future, who it benefits, sort of like the, you know, sort of like what it means. And I think as media scholars and artists, that is our goal. Like that's what we go towards, is what sense are people making of a particular thing. So that's very different from saying, this is the best path forward for X, Y, Z, which I think is more what, you know, what Donna does and others sort of who are situated differently in the field. And I don't think that's without, I wouldn't say that that's not like practical. I just think it serves a very sort of different purpose. Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, I think, thank you very much for that insight. It was very useful. And again, there's lots of questions in the Q&A section and in the chat, which you can respond to further if you'd like to. But just for the sake of time, we might head over to Patrick's presentation, if that's okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Mel, and thank you, Donna, for great presentations and for setting up a lot of what I'll be talking about. So it's kind of nice that a lot of the overview will be fairly quick. Thanks for having me at this webinar. I'm excited to talk about some of my research more broadly in relation to data centers, but then also, I guess, you know, it's kind of nice to end the conversation in this way to talk about how we can look at the more expansive geographies of digital infrastructures, which kind of seem to start with data centers in some ways, but which I'll kind of try to open outwards a little bit. So I'm sure many of you, as you know, based on the earlier talks, are roughly familiar with the Irish data center industry. And I'll just point you towards some of the earlier work that I've personally done on it, discussing particularly in this first paper here on the left, the kind of promotional and cultural politics around data centers. So kind of what Mel was talking about, kind of unpacking what exactly, how people were understanding data centers in Ireland, and then specifically how the industry was kind of understanding itself. And what I kind of noticed as also what Donna was saying in terms of this this myth of the climate as being something that's deeply important for data centers locating in Ireland. But then, so this work, you know, and kind of looking at the climatic and atmospheric politics of these things kind of led me into the work that I've been doing with Dr. Patrick Bresnahan at Maynooth, who you've had at one of the earlier Not Here, Not Anywhere seminars or webinars. And so in our work, we've started to expand understanding of these dynamics of data center development to look at how it was directly affecting other industries and other infrastructures outside of, let's say, necessarily the concentrated point of the data center. And specifically, we found that multinational tech companies were becoming increasingly involved in the Irish wind sector, which was in turn starting to influence how wind was regulated and developed. So more specifically, corporate power purchase agreements and other direct partnerships with wind providers by data center companies, which are these kind of market-led renewable energy development strategies that the Irish state was and continues to incentivize, but which we found didn't really resolve any of the core contradictions or the problematics of data centers, of the scale of data centers' energy use. Because in short, while these companies were able to promote renewable energy commitments through these contracts, the scale of their energy use does dwarf their current purchase of renewable energy. And if the collective energy use of data centers in Ireland kept growing, as you can see on this projection, driven by the presence of just, you know, maybe a dozen or I don't know, the number of data center companies probably numbers close to 24 at this point, but they're ultimately what's driving this demand in Dublin. The replacement of carbon fuels with renewables then would be significantly outpaced by the growth in energy demands by data centers, is what we were kind of finding based on these different things that we are interpreting and reading. And the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities and Air Grid also sort of realized this last year. And they issued a series of recommendations which basically said, well, we can't stop data centers from being built, but we can ask them to do things like build their own on-site power or build closer to energy generation, as was mentioned earlier. So basically saying that planners need to prioritize proposals which wouldn't be in or around Dublin. And Air Grid did issue a kind of de facto moratorium on the development of new data centers in Dublin for the foreseeable future, which will ultimately push data centers out into other areas of Ireland. And specifically, something that we were starting to notice is, in general, the infrastructures of the digital economy were going to become more and more located in rural Ireland, which was something that interested us and which we started to kind of pursue, both in mine and Patty's work together, as well as my kind of more individual work. So we can see here how companies like Bord na Móna, or state agencies, semi-state agencies like Bord na Móna, are starting to get involved with this, right? Kind of imagining the way in which this paired digital and energy infrastructure is going to start to look like, and how it's going to start to be located in more rural regions, right? Where there's more room for energy generation and more room for this development and a less strained grid. So, what we kind of want to emphasize with this work is that the infrastructures of the so-called digital economy, or let's say the fourth industrial revolution, as the World Economic Forum has called it, aren't just data centers. They're also wind farms, solar arrays, tidal generation plants, battery storage facilities, pylons, interconnectors, mining, ports, transport networks, and all the different landscapes and geographies that these require. So, these pictures here, that top left is a site in Leitrim, which is going to be a battery farm developed by Brookfield Renewable Energy Partners, which is a Canadian company. And Leitrim is very close to the border as well, which is something that was interesting in terms of watershed, as I'll discuss in a minute. Top right is a in construction wind pylon for the Meanbog wind farm in Donegal. Bottom left is wind turbines at the Belfast port, and then bottom right is prospecting for, I believe, lithium in Wicklow. And lithium, which is obviously important for battery storage. And so this is where I want to start to kind of open up to my more recent research into, let's say more global and also specifically cross-border issues of energy and extraction through digital industries. So I'm sure some of you may be familiar with the peat slide at the Meanbog wind farm in Donegal in 2020, which happened when the construction of an access road to a new wind farm being built caused a massive cross-border pollution incident. That was the image at the start of my presentation, contaminating a watershed across Donegal and Tyrone and prompting investigations and interventions by agencies on either side of the border. But what was excluded from those headlines about the catastrophic peat slide was the fact that Amazon had invested in this wind farm just about a year before. But even the term investment is in fact a misnomer. It was a corporate power purchase agreement, right? Which means that they were just going to buy energy for the next 15 years. It wasn't actually, an investment in the construction of the wind farm, which was already being planned and developed. But and what was especially, let's say baffling by it was the fact that Leo Varadkar had proclaimed this as evidence of Amazon's climate responsibility and commitment to Ireland just a year before this. And yet when the peat slide happened, Amazon disappeared from the headlines about the wind farm. They deflected media inquiries when asked. And Dr. Bresnahan and I actually were even asked to remove mention of Amazon from an op-ed that we wrote because of potential litigation. So even though it had been released to the press with a statement by the Taoiseach that Amazon had invested in this wind farm, when it came down to it, this responsibility dissolved as soon as it became an environmental incident. But whatever the case, the internal politics of this within Ireland are interesting and worth talking about. I'm eager to talk about them a little more, but I want to use this as an opportunity to open our field of inquiry to wider supply chains, to wider, let's say politics that go beyond, specific data and energy connections, and also to the ways that the data center complex in Dublin can be directly affecting and connected to sites of extraction hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. So, one way that I've been looking at this is trying to look at the implications of this for the all Ireland energy grid, right? Because as you see on this graph, on this chart here, projections in the south are meant to increase by quite a bit over the next 10 years, whereas projections in the north are meant to remain stable, right? So this obviously may have knock-on effects if data centers continue to consume the proportion of energy that they will in the south. What's this going to mean for the shared grid? And so, for example, something that I actually just found the other day is that Amazon is planning on entering a corporate power purchase agreement with the wind farm in the north, right? Which, again, this is a cross-border infrastructure ultimately that we're looking at. But, what does that mean for the regulatory dynamics then when we're looking at things from the south? Another thing that, and also leads into what Donna was talking about, is the issue of heating, right? In these rural areas where these wind farms are being built, where potentially new data centers are going to be being built. As of 2016, this was the last when I found a kind of comprehensive table of this information. These areas are still mostly heated. Household heating still comes primarily from carbon fuels and largely from things like peat as well, right? So this kind of creates an unevenness where if people are going to be asked to reduce household energy use, to reduce electricity use and all these sorts of things, what does that mean when, the example I like to use is a wind farm is being built next door, which may be able to, through distribution through the grid, and may be able to charge your laptop, create heat in your laptop, but it can't heat your home if your house doesn't have electrified heating, right? So this kind of transformation of the grid needs to happen at a wider scale. And then also, we can think about the futures that this implicates, right? So the scale and optimization that these and form of optimization that these developments are going to take are always geared towards this kind of inevitability of a green and data-driven future. And we're told that more tech is going to solve problems of climate change and stuff. But it also comes to require an expanded network of infrastructures, technologies, and labor. So something, tech entails this expanded extraction, different kinds of extraction, and the supply chains that come with it. This book, Planetary Mind by Martina Arboleda, is really, really good at talking about this in terms of the ways that the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution is kind of mapping onto existing mining networks and optimizing mining, but also for, what gets called critical minerals, things like gold, things like copper, things like lithium, which are becoming increasingly incentivized and necessary for green economies. And I just kind of wanted to point out the work that Vincenzo Sierfice has been doing with the people in the Sperrins who are resisting gold mining by Dalradian Gold, which is I think it's also a Canadian company, or at least it's incorporated in Canada, right? So this is something that, as someone in Canada, I need to think about the implications of Canada within these global mining networks. So I just kind of want to end with, here's a video of the peat slide in Donegal, which I'm sure some of you saw, which is, every time you see it, it's just kind of staggering. So just thinking about, this kind of assemblage of things that Donna was talking about in terms of what makes Ireland attractive for these data center companies, also implicates Ireland within this global network of extraction, right? So when we think about the implications that data centers have on different forms of extraction and different methods and geographies of extraction within Ireland itself, we also need to think about the form that this takes when we look at a more global level, and the complicity of the Irish government within these networks, as well as what it means in terms of thinking about a more just future within Ireland itself. So sorry if I went a little bit over time and kind of rushed it there, but that's about all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. That was really interesting. We've got loads of questions coming in just towards the end of your talk there. Particularly, we had one question which I might put to you because I think it's relevant to global, you mentioned it, global extractivism. Someone called Leah says, to what extent, if at all, other speakers are not here in any way concerned about the concentration of data storage in a small number of countries at a point in time when the rules of global governance around data storage and transfer are still developing, and it should be added, are the subject of extremely concerning plurilateral trade rule initiatives being pushed by big tech and global north countries. So that's a long question and a bit of a tricky one, but what do you think?
No, that's something that I, in my own work, I don't get into so much, just because I, kind of, I guess in an almost crass way, I'm really interested in the physical material stuff, and less interested in the, the regulatory politics of data, things like data sovereignty, data justice, and these sorts of things. But yeah, I think that it's something that's, again, and I know I gave Paul O'Neill a shout out in the chat there, but he's talked about this, and I think that the term that he used an example that he uses in one of his tours, introductions to his infrastructural tours of Dublin, where he takes you to the data centers and stuff like this, is, I think it was like not even a decade ago, he did like a, let's say, Google Earth street view of the Irish Data Protection Office, which was this tiny little storefront, right? And he was like, so when it comes down to it, it is quite scary that these massive tech companies have such huge and expansive operations in Ireland. And just a few years ago, we really didn't, we clearly really weren't thinking that this was a priority to regulate things like data and, to ensure data protection and privacy and stuff. And, you see examples, right? Like a few years ago, the FBI tried to force Microsoft tried to force Ireland to repatriate data from the Microsoft data center out in Dublin. And so, and I don't actually remember what came of that case, but you see these things happening, and it is something that, needs to be thought about, as well as in the sense of, it's my next round of questions with this is with Brexit, right? And in the North, and, they're building fiber optic cables to kind of circumvent the UK in the case of data protection becoming an issue with Brexit, right? So that's something that I need to think about more, but I appreciate the question, and it's something that I think, when you're studying this stuff, is very much at the forefront.
We have another question, which I think was maybe prompted by the discussion of the wind farm slide in Donegal. Someone, and also thinking about reflecting on the district heating planning. Someone asked, given the planning constraints for wind farms, including how far away they need to be from houses, and how realistic is it that a data center could be built in a rural area and also include the development of a wind farm to give it the energy? If located in rural Ireland with a limited ability to provide meaningful level of wind generation and the lack of infrastructure for district heating, would it be more beneficial to build in urban areas? I don't know if you have any thoughts about. Maybe Donna could put some thoughts into the chat as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to start, and then I would like to hand that off to Donna, because I think that's much more, her area. But I, just in terms of the examples that, we've already kind of seen of data centers trying to be built in rural Ireland, right? Between Athenry, which, when Apple claimed to be able to provide 100% renewable energy, which was revealed to be not true, because they would have had to, they would have had to figure out a way to secure that, right? Which in the context of the supply in Ireland would have been nearly impossible. The fact that, for example, these wind farms that Amazon is investing in, I believe it's 3, there's one in Donegal, one in Galway, and the third one that I can't remember where it is, but they provide really only like quite a small fraction of what the total energy demand of Amazon's facilities in Dublin necessitate, right? So, this is, and then you look at the planned data center in Ennis, which they wanted to build, gas-fired, like a gas-fired on-site power plant, essentially, to power this data center to provide the requisite amount of energy, which is completely unsustainable and quite, it's something that, I really hope ends up being shot down. But, so it's in these ways, I do think that building data centers in rural Ireland comes with a massive set of challenges, which is going to complicate this moving into the future, because in Dublin, the infrastructure's there, the planning regulations were there, the energy was there. And now that it's not, I'm wondering if the kind of like, let's say, tax friendly business climate, the tax regulations are going to be enough to keep data center companies, kind of developing in rural areas in Ireland. But Anyways, yeah, the district heating stuff, I'll pass it off.
I think I can see that Donna is typing a message, so we'll get some more detail from her. I guess kind of like a summary question, which is what we're trying to reflect on within this whole webinar, is how we can stay connected digitally, but also meet our climate targets. How can we reconcile those two things in a way that provides a socially just transition from fossil fuel to low carbon economy? So if you could answer that for us, Patrick, that would be great. Just thought that out there.
I have no answer for it. It's, you know, it's kind of the wall that I run up against in all my research is, you know, where it's like, you know, like there's a particular part of me, and this is coming, you know, from an area of more personal political leaning, that says that, you know, at the very least, you know, the power and control of these things needs to be taken from the hands of multinational tech companies, essentially, right? So, you know, whether that means a kind of like public works, you know, nationalized data centers or something like this, you know, I don't know. But when it comes that, you know, the kind of the way that these things are fueled by a kind of endless growth and a kind of endless optimization and increasing integration of digital technologies into everyday life, into governance, into all of these things, you know, the fact that, you know, multinational tech companies are kind of at the forefront of these things is something that, you know, I think that should be opposed at many different levels, right? You know, and again, that might be a starting point for figuring out then what comes after that, which, you know, you could do, let's say, much broader scale. Like, you know, I actually need to read more about like what the kind of Green New Deal, you know, proposals for this are at a more global level. Because, you know, I've seen people talk about like, you know, nationalization and, you know, making public these things and stuff. But, you know, the practicalities of that are obviously, you know, wild. So yeah, that's a very non-committal answer to a really difficult question. But yeah.
Mel also said in the chat, abolish the internet, which is like a shorter answer. I might just circle back. Before we end the webinar, I want to share a tool that we have on our website where you can see new data centers that are being proposed in Ireland, and you can apply to them. But we had like one outstanding question, which I thought would be good to circle back to ask Donna, because the question is, if you were approaching a potential data center project and submitting to the planning application, what would be your asks? And I think, Donna, maybe you would have a good answer for that, because
one of the asks, I suppose, is that they publish it, like, you know, that we get an energy say statement where they tell us exactly where their energy is coming from, how much energy they're going to use, what they're doing to offset that energy in detail, you know, in a full energy statement. Now we have, I think some of the local authorities and new county development plans in Dublin anyway are going to have this in there for all developments. So for everything over a certain size, that we'd have that information. So obviously data centers are a big issue, but so are big pharmaceutical plants and other big developments as well, you know. So that would be one. To publish the amount of waste heat that they are going to produce. If they're in these zones, you know, we have the zones marked for Dublin, but also SEAI have just released a heat plan or a heat study for Ireland, which zones all of the district areas in Ireland. So if the data center is in one of these zones that's suitable for district heating, that they would put in the equipment to enable to use the waste heat. And I would also, now maybe Patrick would have a better solution than power purchase agreements, but ensure that, I suppose, that the equivalent renewables, I suppose, that they are offsetting that. So it's not like the question you asked there, Jesse, around the just kind of transition, who pays for this renewable energy. At the moment, consumers are paying for the tariffs through the PSO levy on electricity. So why are we paying on a PSO levy for renewables that have to offset the renewable requirements for data centers? So they should, I suppose, pay an equivalent PSO levy that would take, I suppose, that off the customers' bills, and I suppose go towards building more, building the renewables required to offset their demand. They would be the things that I would ask for, as well as obviously making their buildings as energy efficient. There's a new European code of best practice code for energy efficient data centers, so that they'd have to meet that best practice energy efficiency as well in their buildings. So yeah, there would be some of the things that I'd ask for.
I'm very glad that we're recording this so I can go back and like Google all of those words that you used.
No worries.
That sounded like you know exactly what to ask for.
Yeah, well, we've been hassling the Dublin local authorities for these kind of things for a while now, so yeah, we're pretty much there on our list of asks.
Grateful that you guys are doing that. It makes me feel better. I'm just going to share a couple of resources that we have on our website before we wrap up. So we have, so for people who are interested in data centers and following new data centers that are coming up, this is our website, notherenotanywhere.com/campaigns/data centers. And we have here some information about data centers. We have a link to our last webinar on data centers, and we'll add our new one here as well. And we have a short data center briefing and some more information down here. And then also on our website, we have basically a list where we publish all of the new things that you can submit to. Oops, I lost the link to it. 1 second. Oh yeah, new planning applications, basically where you can submit to the government to say what you would like, or submit to on board Panola, the planning board, to say what you would like to see out of data centers or any other kinds of new projects that might use a lot of fossil fuels. And we have template submissions for gas plants, template submissions to data centers. And so if anyone kind of wants to follow this stuff, you can click these links to see the new planning applications coming up for consultation. And you can just kind of copy and paste if you're not sure where to start. So I'll stop sharing that now, but we've pasted the link to that into the chat as well. So yeah, I think we'll maybe finish there because we're 3 minutes ahead. I won't end the Zoom until we time out in case people want to continue on the chat. But I just want to say thank you so much to our 3 fantastic speakers for sharing the insight and yeah, being so sort of nuanced and frank and introspective in everything that they've brought to the conversation. We're also going to, we're going to basically put together like a highlights reel of this webinar, which we will be we'll be uploading onto the internet, but we'll also be sending to politicians who couldn't make it this evening. And I'm really convinced that, this will be useful to kind of get some understanding around the kind of direction that we need to go in terms of planning and political will around data centers. So I'll leave it at that. And yes, do any of our speakers want to plug anything or sign off or make it? I don't know. If anyone's got any campaigns or upcoming events they'd like to share, you're welcome to share them, and I'll put them in the chat. And I think that's it.
Nothing to plug, but we will be releasing, as I was doing a full public release of that Dublin Energy Master Plan that I spoke about in the next couple of weeks. So again, I'll send on a link maybe to yourselves and you can share it in the group. I suppose it might just be interesting or useful for anybody campaigning or doing any work around any of the kind of planning permissions around the Dublin region.
Yeah, and if we follow Codema on Twitter, that'll be
perfect. Exactly.
Okay,
yes,
that's where we'll find that.
Thanks a million.
Thanks so much.
And thanks a million for asking me to be here. It's been great chatting to everybody and very interesting. Thanks, Patrick and Mel as well. That was great. I wouldn't have known any of that stuff either, so it was great to get an insight. So and I'll definitely be on following your research, Patrick, and and reading some of those papers. It's very interesting stuff. Thanks a million.
Oh, thank you. I learned so much about district heating as well. It's something that I've heard so much about, especially like in Tala, right? But I really had no idea what it actually meant. So this is super
great,
super useful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. I really enjoyed your talks, and yeah, let's keep in touch.